So good evening here in Edith Marian's house near the Goethe-Anum and the friends of Sergei Prokofiev, hopefully all around the world. You are welcomed by the general anthroposophical section here to this remarkable day for all of us who knew Sergei, and in a way unbelievable that it's the 10th death day today. We will have in the evening, that means at 8 o'clock our time, a lecture with music and eurythmy here in the foundation hall of the Goethe-Anum in German. Also with Russian poems and eurythmy by Astrid Prokofiev and piano by Christo Kazakov. But now we decided to have a first lecture here in English for the friends of Sergei who are not here present at the moment at the Goethe-Anum or not even able to follow the German language. And because of the evening event, we'll start in the foundation hall with piano music by Richard Wagner, Parzival. I thought it's maybe a good idea to start also this lecture now with the motif of the Grail, which was so close to Sergei's heart. He was in fact 9 years old when his beloved grandfather Leonid Evgenievich Feinberg read it to him from the libretto of Wagner's Parzival. And there is also a wonderful photo, 1963, Sergei sitting and listening to his grandfather, Leonid Feinberg. And as I mentioned, reading out of the libretto to Parzival and bringing this motif to Sergei. And Sergei's mother, Sophia, wrote in an essay about this situation, Seryosha was deeply impressed, enthusiastic and fascinated. He sat quietly on a small bench that had been made in the village. Snuggled up to his grandfather, he could listen to this wonderful legend for hours. King Arthur and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot, they all appeared in his imagination, but were not just occasional guests, they settled permanently in his soul. And also Sergei told me that some years later, still a child, he had to go to hospital because of appendicitis. And there were so many sick children, deeply touching his heart. And in the evenings, in the room, he started to tell them out of the Parzival story. And Sophia wrote that when she wanted to bring Sergei home, the other children said, no, please don't take Seryosha with you. The story is not finished. In a way, I would say this story was never finished, saying that the Grail story, legend, or let's say the motifs, they were all the time present in his soul. And he wrote that these motifs brought by Leonid Feinberg when he was 9 years old, they questioned his whole inner being. And the question was, where is the contemporary continuation of this spiritual current to be found today? So for him, what is told in Parzival is a spiritual current. But where is it today? We are not living in the early Middle Age. We are living today. this was a child from its early beginning, as he said later, close to the spiritual world. He told me that he always felt connected with a constant feeling that he was born, he was in the spiritual world before birth, in a completely different, luminous and sublime world. So a kind of a longing for this light, where he came from. And he also said, and also in a book, he said, he always felt Christian as long as he could remind himself, like a Christian, with quite a direct access to the gospel. So I started with a 9 years boy, middle of childhood, and with a grandfather, Leonid. And Selg said that deepening the motif, when he was 10 years old or 11, he started to write a manuscript, a drama about Parzival. He was the author. Of course, he's out of a family of artists, writers, composers, translators, poets. So maybe it was also the stream of the family, but also deeply interesting that a child with 10, 11 years old started to write down a drama about Parzival. And a little bit keeping the motif of this middle of childhood or beginning of puberty, there was also an interesting or moving element when he was about 13 years old, that he said to his mother suddenly during a holiday stay in the Baltic Sea that he now is completely different than before. He will change his life, starting with the handwriting. He didn't want to have any more this, mother said, quite ugly handwriting. Sergei was a child who was quite in motion and restless in a way. Not at all ill, but in a way it was not an easy childhood for him and middle of childhood. But then there came a decision when he was maybe 13 years old and he changed completely, starting with the handwriting. And most of us who know Sergei Prokofiev from Dornach know his handwriting, calligraphic. But this started at the beginning of this youth, so early. And not only the handwriting, also some other behaviors. Mother said that quite out of the blue, he seemed to be some years older. And when they came back from the Baltic Sea to the Moscow, he came with a certain wish and said to his mother that now he wants to learn German. So Sofia Prokofieva wrote in an essay with her memories that this was maybe a wish because he wanted to read Steiner, because his grandfather Leonid not only talked to him about Parzival, but also about anthroposophy. Leonid Feinberg felt connected to theosophy, anthroposophy, but maybe it had also to do with the German language of Wolfram von Eschenbach, I thought. But interesting what happened then. The mother Sophia writes, I bought Seryosha some German books and offered to invite a tutor at home. Seryosha leafed through the textbooks and said, Mom, this is not at all what I need. Look here in the textbook, a kitchen, a table, chairs, pans, pots, and here a streetcar stop, carriages, passengers, passers-by. These words are of no use to me. I would like to start with Goethe's Faust. And she said, of course, to him, this is quite a high level of German language, but he said, I will patiently begin with a dictionary. from his own memories. I think most anthroposophists who came across Sergei's books and partly autobiographical writings, they know that for him then, in the later youth, the most important anthroposophical place was Koktebel. That means the house of Maximilian Voloshin on Crimea, and the library also of Maximilian Voloshin, where he discovered Dr. Steiner's writings. And there, almost some years later, it's really youth age now, he found the answer to his posed question about the Grail motif, about where is the continuation of this spiritual content, current in our time there. So he discovered that he, as he said in his own words, held in his hands the description of the path of the human soul to the Christ today, given from the spirit of our time. And this was not just from an author, Steiner, because in a way Sergei discovered that this came out from an innermost essence of an imitation of the Christ. So what we call in Germany die Nachfolge. Somebody obviously following the path of the Christ. Imitatio Christi. So for him it was the essence of this esoteric Christianity, or the Grail current in our time. And quite interesting that the first lecture cycle of Dr. Steiner, Sergei could read later on, some years later on, in German, because then he trained the German language even more intensively then. The first lecture cycle he came across, it was not so easy to get them, but he went to a far distance place to get one. The course was Christ and the spiritual world on the search for the Holy Grail. So this Grail research, which for Sergei was the most sacred thing in the entire development of mankind, was a constant motif. And this is not only biography, because this presentation tonight is not only about biography, because we are now 10 years beyond the threshold of death. But 10 years in the spiritual world, from an anthroposophical point of view, means still recapitulating biography. So in a way there is a certain spiritual value in not only saying now he's far beyond. From an anthroposophical point of view, he's still related to this earthly biography, and we are too. We are related to him and the biography. But it is not only biography, it is also about his life work and the spiritual values he was searching for. So this Christian essence of anthroposophy, for him, anthroposophy was always a method of cognition, but a method of cognition based on the mystery of Golgotha. That means based on forces of resurrection, but now resurrection forces in our ability to perceive and to understand, yes, to fulfill a process of recognition and cognition. So for him, the mystery of Golgotha was not a religious element only. It was a turning point of time for the development of human spirit, for the formation of a new consciousness. And for him in anthroposophy, it was a kind of a conclusion, or a kind of to make true now, 2000 years later, where the seeds were given on the mystery of Golgotha. So it was a beginning. Anthroposophy is not a culmination, but a beginning, what Steiner and Selg understood as a new consciousness of future humanity. But a new consciousness working with these kind of resurrection forces in the process of cognition. For Thomas of Aquinas, this was a leading question. How do we Christianize our thinking? That means, how do we fulfill a kind of a resurrection process in our thinking process? And if we succeed in doing this, then not our thinking capacity is transformed, but out of this process of cognition, we can come to free activities in our limb organization. So out of a new understanding and deeper penetrating into the spirituality of the earth and mankind, we can change our behavior. So to bring a Christian impulse out of us, not only for our soul life. So for Selg, Christianity was never only for the sake of our human soul, but also to transform behavior. As in the famous Sermon on the Mount, it was given. So he followed this path, and there were tremendous steps. He started in the library, as I mentioned, of Maximilian Voloshin, but then he went on and he met friends who were following the same path. I only want to mention here at this point Slava Ivonin, and Slava invited him once to a dacha near St. Petersburg, and in a night Selg was reading there the so-called Arnheim lectures Steiner has given just 100 years ago, because this was middle of July 24. And he told me and some other friends, and he described it also in an essay, how this was a night without sleep, but a night full of consciousness. And he had some others of these experiences in reading Steiner's lecture courses. He mentioned three very important, I mean there were many others, but the so-called Christiania lectures about the so-called fifth Gospels, the Michael letters, and also the Neuchâtel lectures. I think most of you or some of you know quite well what these lectures mean and have maybe had a similar experience than Selg of this being fully awake for the presence of this Grail, the science of Grail maybe. But for him, it was not only a kind of deeply moving experience, but it was a starting point for a decision and a lifelong commitment. And this is as exceptional as Selg was, an exceptional decision for a young man with 18, 19 years. He said, I was choosing anthroposophy as the task of the whole of life, of my destiny in the world. So he committed himself not at all to a sectarian group, but to a kind of this Christian current. And he wanted to commit his life, his full life for this. And then he said in a memorial writing, only when the decision was made about this commitment, when I experienced with all my strength that my life had received a new meaning and a new goal, and when the beginning was made to consciously serve those ideals that I had previously lived in my soul, thanks to the spiritual science, had now become a fully conscious reality for me, then I was led out of my original state of loneliness by the guidance of destiny. He wanted to say, and he described it in detail, that he felt lonely as a child, in the middle of childhood, in puberty and adolescence, even if he had this wonderful mother, and also even if they were divorced, this wonderful father, Oleg. And then the second husband later of Sophia, Victor, and also his sister Marsha was born. And there was an enormous surrounding of Sergei, but inwardly he said, I won't judge personally, but he said, I felt alone, spiritually alone. But now, after this decision, after this being fully conscious, which path I want to follow, he said, this was the end of my original status of loneliness. I've committed myself to Dr. Steiner's spiritual science, to this kind of scientifically founded knowledge of the spiritual world. In one of his last lectures, Dr. Steiner said, it's also almost 100 years ago, it was in September 1924, in this lecture cycle for the priests of the Christian community about the apocalypse of St. John, Dr. Steiner said, looking to his own time, not to his own biography, but to the 20th century, he said, something must return that is similar to the work in the ancient mysteries, and which was described as the sacrificial surrender of the whole human being, the absorption of the whole human being in his task. In his task. If he commits to a task, to our task, not to say the mission, but in the sense of the main intention, we have to sacrifice in a way with our whole human being. And Steiner said this happened in the ancient mysteries, and we know it from cultural history. But it's not very up to date. So people have a life-work balance and have holidays, and it's all fine. But Steiner, in this quotation, says we have to devote ourselves for what is really our main work. And I quote it here because in a way I always perceived Sergei working in this stream, in this devotion, in this commitment. Yes, with an enormous inner courage and what we can call with a kind of foundation stone in his heart, which is by its own nature not of this world. So it was Sergei who made this close connection from the so-called foundation stone of the Christmas conference at the Goetheanum and the Cradle Stone. Sergei's research showed, as I would say clearly, that the foundation stone meditation is not the foundation stone. It is more the protection of it. But the foundation stone inside is a spiritual stone. In the spiritual world, it is a creation of a new world, or the stone for the creation of a new world. Maybe for the New Jerusalem at the end of the time. That means starting point for building a new house for humanity. And in a way, this kind of relationship to this foundation stone of a new world of becoming was for Sergei decisive. And most of you know that he started to focus quite early on the theme of the so-called Christmas conference, the foundation stone and its meditation, Dr. Steiner's biography, In the Light of the New Mysteries, and then the second book about the spiritual course of the year, followed by the 12 Holy Nights, all the book titles. It was a path to the hierarchies, to the spiritual hierarchies, in the sense of Dionysius Areopagita in the esoteric school of St. Paul. It was a path to Christ, Sophia, the spiritual Sophia, and what we call the spiritual Michael principle and he came to enormous discovery. He made a real research, Sergei. He was not only a writer and not only giving commentaries to Dr. Steiner's lectures, but he was an original searcher. And he came to fascinating results, and he felt at the end of his life, close to death, he felt very grateful that he came to these results, or to these insights, better to say, in the mystery of the resurrection body, let's say, in the mystery of the transformation from what he called the Jesus consciousness to the Christ consciousness, or let's say a deeper understanding of the interior of the earth as a place of the Christ, but also as a center of evil, both belonging to the earth, and some more motifs. But I will keep a little bit a motif of evil, because it was an important motif for Sergei. Of course, he's not alone in the history of Russian philosophers, writers, and so on. I always remember when he gave me an interpretation of Sophia's last book, at this time published of the book of his mother, and he interpreted it with a whole Russian philosophy about evil, and also with Bulgakov. And so he had an enormous knowledge and a background of thinking about the mystery of evil. And in Dr. Steiner's anthroposophy, he found a new access to the mystery of evil. So anthroposophy for Sergei never was only, how to say, a very wonderful esoteric gift, but it was more or less a deed to balance evil. Once he said we have to undergo an inhalation of materialism and an exhalation of anthroposophy. That's how we transform the world. Partly we do it every day, to inhale, to inspire materialism on the level of thoughts, on the level of emotions, on the level of technology and culture. But for Sergei was the question, are we now all victims or end results of this materialistic culture, or do we create a counterforce? And for him this was not only a personal wish for several spiritual researchers, but a need for to save humanity. In our time, he wrote, the impulses of evil have become so powerful throughout evolution, and this tendency will continuously grow in the near future, that in wrestling with them, humanity needs inner forces that go far beyond what is usually called good or moral. So we need new forces to balance. So one of his famous books of Sergei was the book The Encounter with Evil and its Overcoming Through Spiritual Science, the cornerstone of goodness, der Grundstein des Guten. And it was a book title from 1999. The book was published, and the cornerstone of goodness. And I will come there to the next point of life and work. This cornerstone of the goodness can live in the heart of a human being, but it won't be very effective if this singular human being is not able to connect with others. So the cornerstone of goodness, also in the sense of the Gospels, is closely connected to the challenge of spiritual community. And this was an important challenge for Sergei, who was really a very individualistic person. Maria Ivanovna, the mother of his mother, called him a Baltic baron, and Baltischer Baron, when he was a child. Oh, my dear Baltic baron. And some other called him Prince Seryosha. And this Prince Seryosha, I think this terminus came out of, not at all of arrogance, not at all, but he was so beautiful, so intelligent. And this kind of, what a lot of people encountered and described later, a moral purity, a rejection of trivialities and lies. This was so striking for the other ones. And a neighbor of him, Valentina Nikolaevna, once she wrote an essay about her encounters with Sergei. They lived in the same house and they were talking about literature quite often. And then she reminded a conversation about Herman Melville and Moby Dick. And suddenly in this discussion or conversation, Sergei said, "Why do we always talk about different things, but never about the most important things?" The most important things, the essentials. So not only rejection of lies, trivialities. Aren't we living on a trivial thing? Aren't most of our conversations just everyday conversations? He wanted to go deeper, and they felt it. So the surrounding felt that he had this kind of depth in the soul, this striving, but he also had this deep respect for human beings, for all people. This kind of sincerity, seriousness, warmth. So in a way, he was a striking individuality as a boy, in puberty and adolescence, as a student, later on. Another Russian friend wrote, "I never met a person in whom brilliant abilities and spiritual powers are combined with extraordinary modesty and simplicity. I've never heard him condemn anyone, make negative remarks about anyone, or make fun of anyone, even if this was done by others." He was not a holy person, but in a way he had striking abilities. And that's what that posed the question, the individual and the community, because he was searching for a community. And I think in the house of Max Voloshin he found the first. But at the beginning more from the historical point of view. Because Max Voloshin, for those who did not know, his house was a kind of an ark, not of Noah, but of Koktebel. That's this wonderful house Maximilian Voloshin erected. At the beginning, his mother was also still alive. After the Russian Revolution, it became the home place for many, many different people from the different sides of the Civil War, the red and the whites. So Maximilian Voloshin, a deep anthroposophist, by the way, a deep artist, was beyond these polarities. He invited the fighters from both sides. And later on, after this horrible war was ended, the house remained to be a kind of an ark. So a lot of people came there. And Maximilian was really, he kept the house and the spirit of the house. And I mention it because Sergei's grandfather, mentioned several times now, Leonid Feinberg, he was a friend of Maximilian Voloshin. He came to the house when he was a young boy, with 13 years old, in a kind of an illness. And then he came every year. So when Sergei came first to Koktebel, Maximilian Voloshin was in the spiritual world since decades. But the family Prokofiev was invited since then. So Sergei first came into the house, I think it was in 71. Now it was in 61, when he was 7 years old with his mother, Sophia. And this is my theme now, it's not a lecture about Maximilian Voloshin and the house and Cocktail Bell, but it was a kind of a spiritual community. And this was a very serious question for Sergei, because if you follow the Grail path, it is always a question of the community. It is not a Grail path for only the individual. And we know it from the story of the disciples. This is a community. So for Sergei, it was clear that building the future means building a spiritual community and overcoming antisocial feelings. This was one of the teaching of Dr. Steiner, that he described how modern development needs to come to antisocial feelings, in distancing from the world, in separating our individual ego from the other ones. We vacant, so we underwent the process of becoming ourselves. So it's by distancing. And this was a huge element in the civilization the last centuries, distancing. And our whole intellectual capacity is partly distancing, objectivity, distance, judging. But such a culture on the soul level ends in destruction. So there is needed a new level of empathy, embracing, sympathy, coming together, loving on a new level. So we have antisocial feelings in the depth of our soul as modern people, but we need to become spiritual social, and we have this ability of selflessness also. So for Sergei, it was a clear question, and he made it then first in the first anthroposophical study groups with Piotr Tchaikovsky and other friends. In Moscow, I mentioned Slava, and there were some others, of course. There was a little community, and they were not only studying Steiner, they did the mystery dramas together, eurythmy together. It was only a little group, but an element of a sense of community, spiritual community. So this was very serious for Sergei, and becoming a destiny community. A destiny community because the Christ had said that the disciples should love each other. They should share their lives. This is also a kind of a karmic community. I mean, St. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, Galater, he said, bear one another's burdens, and we will fulfill the law of Christ. Bearing the burden of the other one, overtaking his burden, also his destiny burden, to become such a community of shared. And this was not easy for Sergei. I mean, it was a main challenge of his life, I would say. He saw it clearly that the Grail stream and this Christian stream needs this community, but it is not easy, because then the so-called anthroposophical society revealed itself also to Sergei for quite a complicated social gathering. So in a way he's devoted his life for anthroposophy and also for the anthroposophical society, and that's also the reason why he came to Dornach, first to Germany, from Bad Boll and so on, but later on to the Goetheanum, to go on with this society and to develop this brotherhood. Dr. Steiner said, anthroposophy as a cause requires real human brotherhood, down to the deepest depth of the soul. An absolute requirement. I wouldn't say that for Sergei the problem was that he had to overcome his antisocial feelings, because he had a kind of purity in his moral element, I think this was for him not a big problem. But the anthroposophical society is quite a mixture of people. And he came to Germany and to Switzerland as a star. That means a young man, and the first lecture he gave, he was 27 years old, knowing the whole anthroposophy, coming from Moscow with the name Sergei Prokofiev. This was a tremendous element. 1,000 people came, wanted to see this man. And there were a lot of admiration, a lot of followers, I would say today, but also then quite an element of distancing, because always if such prominent figures arrive, it creates a kind of tension. And also this admiration is not easy to handle, because he didn't want to be admired at all. He wanted that deepening anthroposophy, but he didn't want to have a Prokofiev culture. And so I would say he entered a difficult society, but he committed himself to it. And it was necessary, because the society is not a group, it is an organ for deepening anthroposophy, bringing anthroposophy to the world. So it's really needed, this society. But to say yes to this society meant for Sergei also to say yes to all those people with their desires and needs, with their personal letters, with their wishes, with their admiration, but also with their skepticism, criticism, and in a way, this shaped also his biography partly. And sometimes he missed also elements of this sacrifice inner element in anthroposophy. As I described, he sacrificed his biography. He committed. But some others, he had a feeling, without judging them negatively, he didn't see this kind of attitude. And to say yes to all these different ways to handle anthroposophy, and also Dr. Steiner, for him, the relationship to the spiritual essence of Rudolf Steiner was very deep and decisive. But he realized that for other anthroposophists, Steiner was the past. And they didn't understood Sergei in this relationship to Rudolf Steiner. They could partly say yes in the relationship to anthroposophy, but why to Steiner? But for Sergei, this was a spiritual question, and he felt completely understood. If, especially in Germany, some people said to him that this is not a modern way to live anthroposophy with this kind of icon, Rudolf Steiner. But his main problem were not the icons. I only want to hint to some of the challenges, but I wouldn't say now from a distance of more than 10 years. This is not because the other ones were the only problem. It is the challenge of a spiritual community in our time. And he said yes, committed not only to anthroposophy, which was not difficult for him. So the commitment for anthroposophy or to esoteric Christianity, this is only yes. But the commitment to a society is to say yes to a social challenge in our world. And this created not an easy situation for him till the end. We all know that Sergei's last years were overshadowed by this illness. And it was a very, very difficult period for him, for Astrid, for the friends around him, for the family especially. He once heard the sentence, "Go through your Golgotha," in this disease time. And in a way, he accepted the disease. He accepted that part of his biography. Of course, he still remained a fighter. I'll come to it a little bit, against the disease, but not in a kind of distance, but saying, yes, now this I have to manage in a way. And in a way, he said to me, this disease and the suffering and the pain brought me even closer to Rudolf Steiner. Because also Dr. Steiner, at the age of a little bit more than 60, underwent a very, very difficult last time. And he felt very connected, Sergei, to this last lifetime of Dr. Steiner. But also he said, undergoing such a pain and suffering is a path, is also an esoteric path of discipleness. I mean, back to Golgotha. So I only wanted to say he accepted also this very difficult situation. These were years from 2011 to 2014. He was going on to work. And I only wanted to focus on some themes because they are still very actual. And one of the themes for him was the future of East Europe and Europe. And especially for him, the German-Russian connection. This is in our time now an extremely complicated theme, and usually it is no more a theme in the public in Germany. It is over, in a way, from a public discussion. At this time, Sergei, he said that for him, this relation is needed, absolutely needed for the future. He didn't mean at all the political relation, but the spiritual, cultural relation, and how we can work for this, for the spiritual, cultural relation. He knew quite well the political disasters and the brutality of Soviet Union. And his beloved grandmother, Lena Prokofieva, came back from the archipel Gulag when he was 2 years old. And the whole Soviet Union history was always a background of Sergei, but he maintained the need for the spiritual relation, not to the politicians. And in Germany, he said, closest to him over the last decades, centuries of Germany, closest to him, he felt to Novalis. For him, Novalis was a kind of a forerunner of the coming Christianity of the next epoch, of the 4th millennium after Christ, and an important spiritual figure for the East European future. And if Sergei said East European, he meant East European. This was not identified by him with Russia, but East European future. When he was 33, he published this book about Novalis. Most of you will know. 20 years later, he published a book on Schiller. I think it was one of the best books about Schiller existing. And of course, he focused on Demetrius, one of the last projects of Schiller. By the way, his mother Sophia wanted to call him Dmitri, not Sergei, because there was already one Sergei Prokofiev. But her husband said, Oleg, you know Dmitri Shostakovich, and you can't now come with Dmitri Prokofiev. And so at the end, Sergei becomes Sergei Prokofiev. But the riddle of Demetrius remained important to him. During the illness in 2012, he made a trip and invited his friends Pyotr Tchaikovsky, but also Volodya Tikhomirov, and they went together to Uglish, the place where Tsarevich Dmitri was killed. And for Sergei it was important that Schiller died with the motif of Demetrius, so with the last drama he had in mind. So this connection. But also it is part of this melancholic element or experience of Sergei that coming to Germany, he had the question, where is Germany? Where is the German culture? He couldn't believe when he came here in the 80s of the 20th century that the poems are not living in the hearts of the human beings, even not in the anthroposophists partly. Where is this Goethe-Schiller culture? He saw influences mainly from the United States of America. And so how to build a spiritual bridge if both sides are in such a difficult situation? And this remained a theme for Sergei. So I realized in the last years of his illness how important this spiritual Russian culture was for him. I really underline it's not a political one, the spiritual culture. I remember him, once I met him in the Allersheim clinic, and he just hid a book in his book when I came in, and I said, Sergei, what kind of book was it? And he said, oh, you know, it is Faust von Goethe in Russian language. So he excused a little bit himself, saying, I always wanted to read him in Russian. So interesting, he started when he was 13 and said to his mother, I don't want to have this textbook, let's start with Faust in German. And then he came back reading Faust in Russian now, very interesting. It was so close to his soul. Once I met him in the Clara hospital after his severe operation, and he was quite mute, or yeah, it was very sad, this situation after the operation, and it was not a real conversation. And then I said to him, Sergei, maybe it's better to go now home. And in leaving the room, I saw a book. And so, oh, is it a biography about Lina, your grandmother, which he called Avia, which is the Catalan name for grandmother. And she is from Catalonia. And he said, yes, stay, I'll tell you about Lina. And then I stayed 3 hours. So 3 hours. Some friends of Sergei know quite well when he started to describe not only Lina, but also. But this was a situation where he was so overshadowed by the disease and by the surgery and by the situation. But then it came with a full power, and this was an enormous element at the end of his life. Russian culture, or let's also say the Silver Age, for those who know a little bit the poetry about Andrei Bieli and Anna Akhmatova and many, many others, he had them all by heart, Sergei. And then he told me that he was a writer as well of poetry when he was young. It was new for me, and he said, yes, I was creating many, many poems. And I asked, are they still available? This was not in the Clara hospital, this was years before. And he said, yes, they could be there. And he went home to mother, and they discovered these more than 400 poems still existing in the old apartment. I mean, the family Prokofiev is living there since the 30s. Stalin created a house of composers. So they got a flat with 5 rooms. So Sergei Prokofiev the first. And still in the room where Sergei lived, the poems were there. And these poems were a work of Sergei when he was 17, 18, 90 years old. 2.5 years, more than 400 poems. And yeah, he said, I awoke from the strong inspiration in the night, and as if I awakened by the verses themselves. I then rushed to the desk to hastily capture the poetic words and images, often to write down a poem that had already emerged completely finished in my inner being, often several at once, almost as if they themselves were striving and flowing onto paper. They were poems of a burning soul. And then he decided they should be published. This was realized in 2013 in Moscow, a red book out of a burning soul. And to work with his mother, Sophia, on the poems was maybe the highlight of Sergei's, or one of the highlights of Sergei's last years. They prepared the edition. Enormous apocalyptic, long poems, longer than Hölderlin. Really apocalyptic. There's a lot of darkness in them, but it's always darkness and light. The world of the spirit. It's death, but in connection with resurrection. It's interesting that he wrote them all in the same room where 10 years before Samuel Feinberg has lived. Samuel was the brother of Leonid, and Samuel was a professor for music. Sergei said it was our Glenn Gould, so the Bach specialist of Russia. And then in the Clara Hospital he gave me a record of Samuel Feinberg playing Bach. And he died when Sergei was 8 years. Before, waking up in the morning, he heard quite often the Goldberg variations and others. Because next room to him, so Sergei's room and this floor on the left side, was the room of Samuel Feinberg with 2 pianos, Flügel, big ones, and Bach. And then he died when Sergei was 8, and then he got the room of Samuel. And in this room, 10 years later, in the House of Composers, he composed these apocalyptic poems. His mother said in the foreword of the edition, I know of no other case in the world of poetry where such a powerful poetic revelation has been born from a soul in such a short time. In such a short time. And she also said in another text, I often ask myself why my son, who was so gifted in both painting and poetry, left the arts and chose a different fate. He studied painting at the Moscow Academy of Painting, but she also gave the answer in the same text. I know that Seryosha had a difficult path of deep spiritual work ahead of him, a path that his soul had chosen, but I know that he would preserve that he was ready for the path he had chosen. Yeah, it is really a path. It is a path to spiritual science. And he said to me, you know, I had to leave arts behind for spiritual science. But there was one birthday in his house. He said, yeah, but I would love to come back a little bit more to arts in the future. I have to fulfill some other tasks, some books, and then I said to him, Sergei, what does it mean, and then? He said, yes, you know, there are 2 stories I would like to write down. But it's, you know, it's truth and poetry. He said in German, Dichtung und Wahrheit, as you know. And I said, yes, truth and poetry, what do you mean? So I didn't want to just let it be. He said, okay. And then he sketched the two stories. The one was about Thomas of Aquinas, his childhood, his youth, his Dominican career, his fighting in Paris, I mean spiritual fights, as you know, and then, yes, and this was astonishing, being part of the group of the initiation of Christian Rosenkreuz in the middle of the 13th century. And the second story was about Rembrandt. So Rembrandt was a constant motif in Sergei's biography. So he did his masterwork there at the Academy of Moscow with an essay on Rembrandt, color and light. But Rembrandt remained close to his soul. And this story about Rembrandt was, as he sketched it to me, Rembrandt, somebody came to Rembrandt, a landlord or a stranger, very noble stranger coming to Rembrandt and ordering a portrait. And then he came for several days for the portrait. He also got familiar with Saskia and Titus, so he was invited to a meal in the family Rembrandt. Because this was not only a noble man, it was obviously a teacher. And he taught Rembrandt what colors are. So during the portraits, he was sitting there and he brought Rembrandt to consciousness what he is doing. And then the portrait was finished. And Sergei could describe it wonderfully. And the portrait was finished and there was a date when the man should come to get the painting. But the man did not come, first time. And Rembrandt getting nervous, standing at the door, getting nervous, not knowing what does it mean. And then starting to look for the man, going in the streets. And then Sergei could describe old Amsterdam, the little streets, the Jewish quarter. At the end, he entered in the harbor and asked, was there a noble man? He just left, yes, with a big ship to Eastern Europe, to Poland. It is a story about Christian Rosenkreuz coming to certain people close to the threshold of the spiritual world and uplifting them or supporting. As you all know, these two books were not finished by Sergei Prokofiev. The Thomas of Aquinas story he told to a group of friends sitting around him at the end of his life. At the beginning, we were not sure if he's able to speak because he was so weak and so thin. But then he started 3 hours. Incredibly. We were totally in Paris. In all the places, it was Thomas of Aquinas. But the Rosenkreuz, the Rembrandt, this was unfinished. We talked about it still a week before he passed away. It was always in his soul. Yeah, how to end. The last book of Sergei, I saw it in the Clara Hospital. He had the book cover on the desk near the bedside. It was about, it was not the last book, but it was one of the really last ones and close to the illness. It was about the Christ statue. Dr. Steiner's work on the Christ statue in the Goetheanum, a wooden one. It's a wonderful book about Sergei's approach to the statue, the representative of mankind, and Steiner's relation to it. So part of Dr. Steiner's life work that he had to create a new image of Christ for our time And for our time, this means also between the powers of evil. They surround not Christ, I would say, but humanity to create this image for the future and to pose it to the Goetheanum, to the center. This was very important for Sergei. He didn't go so often to the statue, he said to me. He didn't go often to the studio of Dr. Steiner because he said to me, it's too heavy for me. So the spiritual impressions are so intensive that it's lasting for days and weeks and months if I go to these places. So only rarely in holy moments, or once he also showed his mother. And he also wanted to die close to this image of Christ. He had a kind of a copy of the head, not a kind, but a copy of the draft of the Christ's head, which Steiner sculptured in Easter 1915. Almost 99 years later, or 99 years later, close to St. John's Day, a little over St. John's Day, so 26th of July, today, 10 years ago, Sergei went to the spiritual world, and there was this sculpture, of course, close to him. In a way, he said, I'm longing for the spiritual world. Time has come. But of course, it was also hard to go and to leave the mother on earth. And the unfulfilled work, but I don't know. He said, partly it is fulfilled. I've done what I could do for this time. And I will go on supporting from the other side, supporting mainly the Goetheanum. This was for Sergei a very strong commitment. I mean, anthroposophy, of course, but also the Goetheanum. He said, there are always people and times and situations, they come and go. And he said it to me also because I have a certain relationship to Ita Wegmann, and she was really brought out of the Goetheanum, and the anthroposophical history of the Goetheanum is full with these difficult stories of separation. But he said, yes, but these are human beings and social crises, but the Goetheanum will survive. And the School for Spiritual Science, the Goetheanum, this is where we were working for. And this is a path to the future. So he always said to me, keep the relation and try to do the best for the sake of the Goetheanum. This is for him not a political question, but a spiritual question. That the Goetheanum may become a place where the being of anthroposophy could find its home on earth, as he said. And I will end with two other quotations close to my heart. The other one I found in a book Astrid has edited now with memories of certain people to Sergei. And one of the most striking sentences in the book, beyond what Sophia, the mother, has brought, which is the treasure of the book, which is the essence of the book for me. But there is another memory from a Netherlandish anthroposophist, and she told that Sergei was asked in a conference in the Netherlands about a Christmas conference, of course, and they asked him where the continuing effect of the Christmas conference can be found today. So one of these very serious questions brought to Sergei. And now we can, if we would have time and conversation, we could think, what do you think, what would be the answer of Sergei? What he said there was, Look at the eyes, at the light in people's eyes. This was the answer. The continuing effect of the Christmas conference can be found today in looking at the light in the eyes of human beings. A last quotation from Selg and then of a friend of him. I found it very also deeply moving that Selg said in a very public lecture in Bologna, 2011, the 31th of March, there was at University of Bologna a congress, and he gave a wonderful speech. And there is a sentence, every person walks the path to Christ, provided he begins the journey to the origin of his own being. Every person walks the path to Christ, provided, that means under the conditions, he begins the journey to the origin of his own being. I hope that this kind of, I wouldn't say memorial, it sounds so graveyard-like, but this kind of bringing Sergei Prokofiev into our consciousness contribution tonight brought us in the nearness of this path. And now I will really end with a quotation, a little bit changed, paraphrasing words from Valentina Nikolaevna. She was the biographer of his grandmother Lena, this famous Lena Prokofiev, and she wrote 7 years, but this is 3 years before. So the only change in the sentence now is that I made 10 years. So she wrote, now 10 years have passed without him, but he's actually with us, alive and beautiful and embodying the divine hypostasis of the human spirit. Now 10 years have passed without him, but he is actually with us, alive and beautiful, and embodying the divine hypostasis of the human spirit. Wonderful sentences by Valentina Nikolaevna, the biographer of the beloved grandmother Avia, Lena Prokofiev. So thank you all for listening, focusing, concentrating on Sergei Prokofiev. Thank you all for being with us, or better to say with him, today here at the Goetheanum Hill, which was so important for him and still is, but also hopefully also in Moscow, in Russia. I heard that maybe Masha, his sister, and the mother Sophia will be with us. And I'm sure many friends in South America, where Sergei was often a guest, but almost all countries in the world where anthroposophical friends invited him for lectures, seminars. He deepened with them anthroposophy, and they never forgot him, and maybe in this sense alive and beautiful and embodying the divine hypostasis of the human spirit.